Let's get started with the third and final topic for the roundtable. Our third speaker is Leigh, professor of political theory at the London School of Economics. She specializes in Chinese and comparative political theory there. She has served as editor of the American Political Science Review and currently stands as a member of the APSA Council. She has received numerous major grants, most recently the Chinese Global Orders Global Convening Program, which is funded also by the British Academy. Her publications include Making the Political, Founding and Action in the Political Theory of Jiang, which came out with Cambridge in 2010, and Changing Reference, Learning Across Space and Time in China and the West, which came out with Oxford in 2015, as well as articles in the American Political Science Review, Political Theory, Modern China, and Hongkong. Please join me in welcoming Leigh Jenco.
Thank you very much. I hope to offer what I take to be a complementary perspective on a lot of the ideas we've already been talking about today. So I want to ask, what are we doing when we celebrate civilization or culture, particularly when we celebrate its diversity and we seek the inclusion of other cultural strengths or insights? One prominent way this is often done is via the inclusion into established scholarly conversations of so-called classic texts or great books, such as those of Taoism. And we've been speaking today of the Tao Te Ching specifically. So this method of inclusion is particularly interesting, I think, when it's done by societies or in academic contexts enjoying dominant socioeconomic or geopolitical power. The most well-known examples, which have already been mentioned, are perhaps those of Orientalism, when the Wisdom of the East book series were translated and incorporated into colonial knowledge production by 18th century Orientalists such as William Jones. But speaking as a scholar who works on Chinese political thought within a field of political theory, which is a profoundly Eurocentric field of study, not exactly known for its global inclusivity, and who is therefore always fighting to legitimate her interest in so-called non-Western ideas, I have become particularly interested in the question of how canons of great texts work to include and exclude. When we incorporate Chinese classic texts into Western canons or vice versa, what are we hoping to achieve? How do canons of great books function both to discipline thought as well as to enable innovation? And what happens when those canons, those sets of classic texts, globalize or attempt a diversification of their content? I focus my talk on a number of different, seemingly disconnected things around a similar theme. I first examined the great books curricula that were developing starting in the 1920s as a way to discuss what classic texts or great books should be and the difficulties of incorporating foreign classics into this predominantly Western-centric curriculum focused, in fact, on delivering to students the essence of Western civilization. And I do this with a comparative look at canon formation that took shape around the five classics, the Confucian five classics, looking especially at the Shangshu. I will then connect all of this with Xi Jinping's more recent global civilization initiative to explore its relationship to how we think about cultural appropriation now and in the past. First, let me just introduce a little bit about what canons are, or how I'm thinking about the classic texts that canons often feature. So, although the term great texts or classic texts may not be used in every field of study, most disciplines studied by students in university are introduced to them by reference to some set of core texts, forming a canon around which the discipline organizes its inquiry. Political theory, which is sort of my field, is among the most explicit of these modern disciplines in linking its practice to a set of canonical texts, some of which date to antiquity. This historical link is a means of legitimating political theory in certain ways rather than others. The typical story, often called Plato to NATO, presents political theory as a long-standing historical practice informed by intellectual giants, typically starting with the ancient Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle, and culminating in the rise of liberal democracy. So if you're to take a class, for example, at the LSE, called GV100, Introduction to Political Theories. You start with Plato. Yeah, you taught it. Well, Kelly's still teaching it. You start with Plato, you go to Aristotle. There's some fuzziness there around the medieval period. Sometimes you read Aquinas, you usually read Machiavelli, and then you sort of accelerate into modernity with Rousseau, John Locke, Hobbes. Marx is sometimes in there occasionally. There's very few women and no non-white people in this set of texts, right? This link that political theory holds between the present and the past also has the effect of delineating what counts as political theory. In this example, it would seem political theory is something that looks like what Plato and Aristotle do, whatever you take that to mean, rather than something that looks like, say, marine biology. But this story that we tell ourselves in my field about the inevitability of Western civilization is not, in fact, natural. It has a history of construction. Reading lists and curricula for Western civilization courses across major U.S. universities, starting with Harvard in the late 19th century, marshaled a series of great texts, often modeled on the classics canon or the classic tripos at Oxbridge, right? To help first-year university students in the U.S. familiarize themselves with the basic values and history of Western civilization in the wake of its devastation after World War I. So insofar as Western civilization was seen in the early part of the 20th century as both the most advanced and only legitimate civilization in the world, this curriculum of great books was also construed as both globally relevant and timely. So perhaps the most famous and long-running experiment in a great books curriculum was at Columbia University in New York. In 1919, Columbia introduced a core course called Contemporary Civilization, later called the Common Core, which would come to be a class required of all students at the university in some form or another. Other core classes across the United States, and then eventually the world, would replicate its structure and form, introducing students to what were widely regarded as great texts. Gaining familiarity with these texts was presumed to be necessary for the basic, that is, foundational or core, cultural education of university students, which could help them understand their place in a long heritage of unfolding freedom associated nearly exclusively with Western civilization. The drive to produce a great books curriculum was also driven by a particular kind of political stance. It argued that students reading the Greeks and Romans were participating in this specific heritage in a very special kind of way. Now, other kinds of canonical movements, we might think here of the 8th century Abbasid translation movement, one of the largest such translation efforts in human history, incorporated Plato and Aristotle by translating them into Arabic, and it was organized around the understanding and inclusion of foreign knowledge. But in contrast, the Columbia Great Books curriculum was meant to emphasize and further cultivate a presumed cultural continuity between, on the one hand, its students and readers, and on the other, the ancient civilizations, here specifically of Greece and Rome, presumed to be its ancestors. And it was believed that reading such texts would impart to students a more systematic understanding of what they already knew as members of something called Western culture, but didn't know yet. They didn't know yet that they knew it. Although none of the students may have encountered these texts directly before, works such as those by Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and then occasionally Shakespeare were so influential in structuring Western life, the argument goes, that their ideas already form part of the mental furniture. This is a word used by John Van Doren much later to describe his involvement in this curriculum. They were influential in forming part of the mental furniture of young people, whether they were aware of this fact or not. So what's interesting to me about this argument for a great books curriculum is that it made it difficult to include classics from outside Western civilization in the core curriculum at Columbia, except out of recognition that perhaps these classics too delineated a clearly bordered community who had already grasped its key lessons. One member of the Columbia faculty, the renowned sinologist William T. DeBerry, Ted DeBerry, argued that the Asian classics, and this was his word for it, Asian classics such as the Analects of Confucius or the Tao Te Ching, should be included in the core curriculum because they too were products of one of the, quote, major mature traditions of the civilized world, unquote. In other words, to DeBerry, Asian classics qualified as great books because they showcased advanced or mature civilizational qualities analogous to those in the West, and had informed long-running conversations on the good life in ways similar to other major traditions. Now, DeBerry's efforts were not entirely successful, particularly outside of Columbia, for reasons directly related to why the core curriculum was proposed in the first place. If the justification for including classic texts as part of a student's basic education was due to the fact that students lived, supposedly, in a culture that was already held to be defined in part by its engagement with these historical texts, why and how should students engage with great texts outside of that culture? Part of the problem here may lie in how those great texts or classic books or classics are defined and the work that they are understood to do. The Columbia canon creators of the 1920s all seem to assume that these great texts would be self-evident. The problem they faced was not how to identify the great texts, but how to gather them together for scholarly examination and education. But this approach to great texts is in some ways putting the cart before the horse, or at least failing to recognize that the very creation of a classic text is in some ways a chicken and egg scenario. That is, there are no classic texts without readers of classic texts. So to understand why this is a chicken and egg scenario, consider these questions. Where does a classic come from, after all? Would we know one if we saw one? Perhaps most of all, can I write one? Have you ever thought about that? Could you contribute to a canon? Could you write a classic text? As Kanal Condren has said, classic texts are not written so much as they are read. That means their greatness cannot really be determined by reference to either some inherent quality or to their content. Human beings have generated huge amounts of textual material to inform intellectual inquiry, and only small bits of this get eventually transmitted as great, despite the fact that there are likely many more examples of deep, rich, and meaningful work outside of established canons of great texts. Rather, their greatness or their classic status is called into being by the people who read them and need them. No one sets out to write a classic text or contribute to a canon. In fact, one characteristic of canons is that they are often closed by the time people start to consider them canons. We might want to ask instead, why do some texts become read as classic over time when others do not? We might turn to consider a much longer-standing canonical tradition to gain some traction on these questions. One prominent tradition emerged out of the breakup of the Western Zhou Empire in Eastern Asia, starting in the 8th century BCE, which is now claimed as part of Chinese civilization. Its focus on great texts over such a long and fairly continuous span of time, dating from the Zhou dynasty even to the modern era, makes the Chinese classics and the debates about the inclusion in these canons a useful lesson in how great texts make possible the languages we use to evaluate and make sense of political life. But as it turns out, which texts were important was a matter of great debate with serious consequences for politics. What people were reading and how they read them and who the readers were mattered here. So one set of texts, there's a lot to talk about in the history of Chinese canon formation or Sinophone, cultural, civilizational ecumene, and the set of texts that are attendant to that. There's a lot to be said. But one set of texts which I will talk about here, which occupied a particularly privileged position, was the 5 classics, which played a key role in formulating policy and legitimating political rule in some form for centuries. But their subject matter was extremely diverse and covered subjects well beyond politics. So just for your reference, I could cold call somebody and ask if they know what the 5 texts are, but I'll just tell you, and I'll say them in English. The Classic of Poetry, Classic of Rites, the Spring and Autumn Annals, the Classic of Changes, the Classic of Documents. So that's the Shijing, the Di, Chunqiu, Li Jing, Shangshu, the 5. Should we call it a Confucian canon? It has been called that. But what's important here is not the details of the content of these 5 classics, but the fact that their internal multidisciplinarity, which you get some sense of just on the list that I just gave you, nourished a huge range of debates that inform political life in unexpected ways. I mean, you have everything from the classical poetry, which is a collection of folk songs and court hymns dating as early as the 12th century CE, all the way up to the classical documents, which is a set of political pronouncements and edicts and documents, many of them fragmentary. You have the Classical Changes, which was a divination text later read as a book of metaphysics. So when confronted with a new situation or political problem, scholars and statesmen typically look to the five classics for guidance, even as their education in the five classics shaped what they took to be a problem in the first place. We can see this reflective process at work by observing debates over the concept of the mandate of heaven, which is a persistent and longstanding Chinese political theory of political legitimation. This concept is first articulated in the Shangshu, the classical documents, where it is seen as a justification for Zhou rebels to usurp power from the reigning dynasty, the Shang, because unlike Shang rulers, whose basis for authority lies solely in their patrilineage and their connections to a particular kind of deity, Zhou rebels, who are trying to usurp them, argue that political legitimacy is instead secured exclusively through the virtuous actions of the ruler, who then becomes endorsed by heaven, hence the mandate of heaven theory. So this theory of legitimation appears in stories and documents throughout the five classics. In part, this theory appears because the compilers of these classics were attempting to justify the establishment and continuation of the Zhou cultural legacy, which they saw as established through precisely such an exercise of virtue. But what is interesting is that these stories, these claims, or these theories about how legitimacy should be established were later used as factual evidence of the virtue and unity of Zhou rule, when later commentators blurred what started out as a political theory, that is the mandate of heaven, with purported historical reality. Some commentators used the classic to claim anachronistically that all Chinese rulers since prehistoric times led a highly centralized empire through the power of virtue alone. Now, these questions take on greater significance in the face of China as a rising global power, when its leaders increasingly reach back into its own canons for theories just like the one I described, to figure out and articulate the norms and shape of an emerging China-led global order. The mandate of heaven has even been invoked by contemporary Chinese leaders to justify where and how they rule. Their proclaimed rule is held to be sufficient evidence of their claim to jurisdiction over particular territories. Modern scholars such as Zhao Tingang have even used these classics to claim that China has always promoted the peaceful extension of its values. This is a classic example of using the mandate of heaven as a factual claim rather than a theory. So despite the well-recognized use of violence in controlling and expanding their borders throughout dynastic history, political theories such as the mandate of heaven, drawn from a set of classic texts, enable these kinds of arguments to be launched. Now, most prominently, Xi Jinping has recently given voice to these ideas in the promotion of the Global Civilization Initiative, which has been touted by official sources as, quote, full of Chinese wisdom, unquote, in crafting a global future. Part of what this Chinese wisdom entails is a dialogue between civilizations to establish harmony and downplay global conflict. In the words of a recent article in the Global Times, a recognized mouthpiece of the CCP, quote, Chinese President Xi Jinping highly values cultures and has profound understanding of culture which strengthens over time. To him, culture plays a unique and irreplaceable role in the rejuvenation of China and the building of a global community of shared future. He speaks for Chinese wisdom, which has been passed down for millennia, advocates for mutual prosperity of global civilizations, welcomes the flourishing of popular cultural products, and encourages the youth to join the path to inheriting and reinventing their proud traditions, unquote. Although this initiative, sometimes called a vision of civilization, in deference to the name of the Chinese leader, civilization, not my pun, if this is actually expected to call this civilization, emphasizes dialogue and the exchange of diverse cultures. It reiterates ideals of harmony that are strongly redolent of the conformity to Chinese cultural norms assumed by the classical documents and its mandate of heaven. That is, the world would be in harmony if only everyone would realize we are all the same, and that certain leaders are already promoting the right kind of values to lead us there, if only we would listen. For Xi's Global Civilization Initiative, inclusion of diverse cultural viewpoints is possible on the assumption that we are all ultimately going to agree on the same things. It mimics the logic of the mandate of heaven when leaders claimed legitimacy to rule on the basis of how well they embodied some assumedly universal and self-evident set of values that also happened to be identical to those of Han Chinese civilization. The vision of exchange and world harmony that emerges from this initiative then seems to me not political solidarity or a common cause hashed out through debate and deliberation, but, quote, the setting aside of differences, which is a very frequent invocation in such rhetoric, on the assumption that a right answer is out there. And guess who's already providing it? Yet the diverse sources for the Chinese classics themselves and the various editorial efforts over time to whip them into some kind of shape meant that readers have always been confronted with material that pull against such neat coherence or the political unity it was meant to secure. So, for example, we might look to other episodes in the Documents classic itself, as well as material in other parts of the five classics, like the classic of poetry, which records glorious ballads of the virtue of Zhou kings and their heavenly mandate. Yet alongside these includes folk songs told from the perspective of poor farmers, including women and girls, some of them overtly sexual, celebrating everyday experiences, including illicit love affairs at far removed from the Zhou court. So canons and sets of classic texts are sometimes presented to us as fixed, clear, and stable. That is certainly the way the five classics appeared to many interpreters in the Chinese Han Dynasty. And I wonder if there's some notion of this, listening to the presentations today, I wonder if there's also some notion of this carried through Western appropriations of Chinese wisdom or Chinese classics, right? A lot of this gets taken up in the 19th and 20th century when Europeans and Americans look to the wisdom of the East, right? But as we have seen, their meaning changes over time based on how they're read and for what purpose. As contemporary politicians and philosophers of the 21st century invoke the mandate of heaven, or the ideals of civilizational unity presumably lying behind it, they change the meaning and potential applications of those classic texts again. But remember, the same mandate of heaven that supported in the imperial unification in the early Zhou period, and which arguably underlies contemporary calls for global civilization under Chinese rule, has also supported claims by beggars, prophets, and secret societies throughout later centuries to reject the legitimacy of the current dynasty and proclaim themselves the true rulers of the land. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the mandate has also been given a democratic reading. It is used to support the idea that the people's interests should be the foremost concern of any regime, and even that it is the people alone who determine the mandate to rule. These interpretations show that classic texts continue to be debated and read into the 20th century, and even now remain touchstones for the reconstruction of Chinese political thought in our time and place. But their sheer plenitude suggests strongly that classic texts can only ever be what we make of them. They may provide resources when we need them, and they may sometimes confirm our most established assumptions rather than undermining or interrogating them. But there's no denying that we have the capacity, we in the present have the capacity to continually create new canons, maybe more suited to global, diverse, internally complex life in modernity. So in this sense, Ted DeBerry was right when he pointed out that texts, including those of the so-called Asian classics, were important because they stood, quote, not just as museum pieces, but as part of the historical process of the emerging world civilization. I'm going to end there because I have a lot more questions for where this could go, but maybe I'll leave them for the roundtable. Thank you.
Questions? Yes.
I have maybe a long question, but I will cut it as short as I can. So, would you compare between the Shangshu mandate of heaven and the Han Dynasty mandate of heaven? Because I have a very frequent reading of the Han Dynasty mandate of heaven. I think it's kind of a debt to the heaven created by the previous legalist movement of kind of saying it's all human. It's all human that kind of creates our home fate, and we can revolutionize the statehood and stuff. Even though I would say
like context, it's like that kind of
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I would say it kind of, I mean, the Dong Zhongshu's kind of unity between heaven and man is very, very. It's much more religious than Confucius, in my opinion.
So one of the things I don't necessarily want to adjudicate right and wrong interpretations of classic texts. One of the things I was trying to say is not only are sets of classic texts quite protean in the sense that they include lots of different things that are sometimes contradictory or just internally diverse, but they're also subject to profoundly different interpretations over time. And that's behind my call to think about how it is that classic texts are made by their readers, not just self-evident repositories of insight, which is how we often treat them, and maybe how early Western Orientalists treated like the wisdom of the East when they were translating things like the Tao Te Ching. Right? So that's sort of my point. My point isn't necessarily to intervene in how the mandate of heaven should be interpreted, but that it gets interpreted in lots of different ways over time. Yeah.
Yes, Becca.
Yes, you mentioned the kind of LSE typecast of what political philosophy is and how that's kind of pervasive in a certain kind of genre, if you like. And this interconnects interestingly with the kind of Russell description that we had earlier in terms of the debate about objectivity. Because one of the
The debate about
objectivity
objectivity.
in science,
Oh gosh,
and one of the interesting things is nobody talks about objectivity anymore. But you know, this used to be the paradigm in the UK university system up until very recently. You know, objectivity and impartiality was the rule of law. Like.
Probably because we've established transparency, objectivity, equal treatment, fairness. But maybe those are just fait accompli, and we can move on. No, I'm kidding. That's a joke. Yeah, that's a joke. I think LSE thinks they've done it. They've cracked it somehow.
The interesting element about that is that it coexisted so fantastically with an ignorance about most of the world. You know, because objectivity, impartiality, and the view from nowhere, you know, seemed to be either the view from the LSE or the view from Bloomsbury or the view from Massachusetts, but it certainly wasn't the view of the world as it claimed to be.
Yeah.
And nobody makes that claim today. So the question is, you know, what kind of political philosophy was it? And what kind of political philosophy do we want to be?
Yeah. So I pioneered a new course at the LSE called Global Political Thought, which is a second-year undergraduate lecture course. And I, in fact, taught my last lecture in that course today. So it's very fresh in my mind. But one of the things I tell the students about why I find teaching the course difficult is, well, first, I don't have expert knowledge of much of anything. I know a bit about China, I know a bit about the history of European political thought, and I don't know a whole lot about everything else. But I kind of established that it's important to have these kinds of conversations and at least make the attempt to present political thought as something that is happening across diverse times and places, not just in ancient times, not just in modern times, but also across time and space in lots of different kinds of situations and spaces. So we read a huge range of texts in that course. And we were talking today with the students about what they had gotten out of it, and we were kind of wondering about this question. What do we do with the fact that we now know that there's a huge diverse range of thought about politics in the world, and has been across time and space? What do we do? What do we do with that fact? And I think that this is the question that upon which political theory, or the remaking of political theory in a more global way, really founders, because political theory or political philosophy is a normative discipline. It presents itself as existing to formulate and defend normative ideas about politics, about how things should be, not just how things are. It's not empirically descriptive. It's attempting to be transformative. It's attempting to provide new imaginaries for political action. And in doing that, it's often very hard to think about what a global perspective would, in some ways, add to that. Because so many people assume that they have a certain set of historical commitments based on the modern world in which they grew up, and so the assumption there is to then just study the modern world, right, and its antecedents, which, as Quentin Skinner famously identified, were in the West. They were European, right? Now, one way is to completely reject that assumption, which I have done in research. Another way is to think about what normatively are we to do with the fact that there's a great diversity of global political thought in the world? And some of the students today mentioned one possibility is knowing, once you know that there is a diversity of thought, much of your own understanding of the world is denaturalized. That is to say, it seems to become less natural to you or less self-evident because you know there are alternatives. You may not accept all of those alternatives, but simply knowing that they're there makes a difference to how you think and how you justify your own actions and thought. So, but there's a lot more to be said about this. A lot more to be said.
I think so. Yes. Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, hi, Leigh. I think it's really fascinating, and you mentioned the classic text, Chinese text, Confucius classic text, and you try to connect it with China in modern China, China in a global context, or China in a world system. It's really good, and I think many maybe Chinese scholars, students, haven't done their work. And I was thinking about what might be interesting. It is, because your discipline is political
Theory,
political science. So how Chinese people perceive state. In Zhou dynasty, the body of the state is often compared to the body of a family, patriarchal family. So how Chinese people's perception of state changes over time, and especially in the modern global context. Do Chinese people change their views of state? Like in my research field about, my particular interest is about feminism. While in Zhou dynasty, in Confucius culture, women need to follow their fathers before getting married, and their husbands while they are married, and their sons when their husband died. So it's like, but now modern Chinese women have a totally different view, under the influence of foreign, this feminism movement in the West. So I think, it's very interesting. There is a lot of research work to do.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about China, Chinese history, there's a lot of it. And I don't know, and I only know a tiny piece of it. But I have a PhD student working on the reception of Western feminism in China in the 80s and 90s, so maybe you can connect with her. But anyway, I wanted to say, I don't necessarily know about the state. One observation I wanted to make on the basis of what you just said is ideas about legitimacy, which ties up to mandate of heaven stuff. But it's very interesting to me that in political science and political theory, there are no theories of legitimacy that do not take democracy as in some way foundational. So another way of saying that is we have trouble understanding, we don't have a theory of legitimacy that can explain state legitimacy other than through reference to its degree of democracy or its degree of democratic institutionalization. And of course, that doesn't make sense of a lot of places in the world, the main one being China, right? Because it's accepted as legitimate in some senses, but we don't have a way of thinking about normatively how it can be justified, right? And people are working on this in the sense that it's mainly empirical scholars of Chinese politics who are thinking about why does the Chinese state appear legitimate? Why do people claim it's legitimate? We don't have a way of understanding what legitimacy means other than in a modern liberal democratic Western context, right? That's the whole premise of political science. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Please go ahead.
Can I add something to this?
Oh, sure.
Topic? Because I first I want to say the state as we mean it is kind of a modern concept, and I would say legitimacy would be definitely a better idea to talk about in terms of its pre-modern history. And I would say in terms of the change, I was talking about the Han Dynasty and Shangshu Dynasty are really different, because I feel like this mandate of heaven in Han Dynasty is basically what Freud would say mass neurosis, because it's a debt to the killed father. It's kind of like, we had this kind of pre-Qing, the pre-unified kind of heaven, which is relational. You have this kind of relationship between father and son, the older brother and younger brother. But then in Han Dynasty, it's all kind of a debt to the heaven. Like if there's a kind of a natural crisis, the emperor has to make apology to the whole state. And in the 3rd century, when there was a planetary catastrophe, the whole legitimacy was shuttered down because of this kind of unity between heaven and man. So I would say there's definitely a problem there, and I would say if it's implied into China today, if we readapt this kind of heavenly order, the under heaven order, it's very, very problematic in my
Yeah,
opinion.
well, I mean, I'm not saying we should do that either. I'm observing that these concepts have a career.
Yeah.
I have a tiny question. I don't think we have time for this, but I just want maybe I could sit in there, but basically, my tiny question has to do with the translation of Western canonical texts into China in the 1910s and 20s, which was maybe brief, but happened alongside the first sort of lead up to sort of the groups that wanted to invite Russell to China, were more aligned with one group that were maybe more liberal than Marxists, but were the first to really translate Plato and Aristotle. So the first translation of the Nicomachean Ethics was in 1905, maybe.
Just making up the instruments. So what was happening is that a lot of these were coming from Japan. They were translated into classical Chinese in Japan.
So, I mean, I suppose, given, the sort of, what was happening in terms of that as an indication of maybe some contestation with regard to the otherwise seamless history of, the, use of the Confucian classics in Chinese political theory as you were presenting? Were there, moments of these,
So, actually, what's very hard to, I guess, wrap my head around in the Republican period is that I would say every 3 to 5 years, public intellectuals changed their minds about what they were promoting or what they were interested in. Different kinds of things became fads and then died out. So there was never a stable kind of set of people who were dedicated to translating something called the Western classics that I know of. So a lot of the work that I read in the 20s and even the 19-teens and the 1920s, you get a very different picture of what Europe looks like at that time and what they take to be important about Europe. And this increases starting in the 1920s as more and more Chinese scholars have the ability to go study in Europe and America, and then their language skills are getting better. They're bringing more things back. I don't even know when Plato was translated. Rousseau was translated in fragments starting in 1905.
I think it's the same journal that we're talking about. There's one journal doing this. I suppose my more sort of broad, bigger systematic question is in what sense did the notion of the classic get contested also as China moved into the modern period, like the Republican China, especially when the very notion of the classic is contested with this other group wanting to translate Western Civ classics, like the great books curriculum, into.
Yeah, it was my understanding that a lot of this got in the United States at least, but a lot of this got kind of what's the word, solidified with these great books curriculum after World War I, because everybody was starting to think about where civilization was going, Western civilization was going, and these kinds of things shore up an identity for what Western civilization is. And then there's more at stake in what a classic text is at that moment, because they're committed to rebuilding Western civilization from the ashes of World War I. And it's a very comforting idea. But this idea of a stability of people persisting through time in the Republican period, translating work, that doesn't, maybe I've just read the wrong things, but I've read widely in that corpus of text, and I don't, it's just not how things work.
Small question was like,
Yeah, like it's a, yeah.
Maybe we should leave it here. We have a small break and then move on to the round table after.